In 1921, Frank Seiberling was worth over $100 million. He had built the largest tire company on Earth. Presidents sought his counsel. His mansion sprawled across 3,000 acres of Ohio countryside. 6 months later, he was out. Bankers from New York had taken everything. The company he created from nothing, the empire he had spent 23 years building, was no longer his. He was 62 years old. But this is not simply a story of rise and fall. It is the story of what a man does when he loses everything except his reputation. It is about a house that became a monument to both triumph and tragedy. And it is about a meeting in a small cottage on that estate that would change millions of lives around the world. Stan Hywet Hall still stands today in Akron, Ohio. 65 rooms, over 64,000 square feet of Tudor grandeur. Most visitors admire the architecture, the gardens, the antique furnishings. Few understand the full story of the man who built it. Frank Seiberling was not born wealthy. He did not inherit his fortune. At nearly 40 years old, he was unemployed with 3 children and no prospects. What happened next would transform a small Ohio town into the rubber capital of the world. This is the entire story of Stan Hywet. The ambition that built it, the fortune that paid for it, the crisis that nearly destroyed its owner, and the unexpected legacy that continues to save lives almost a century later. Please subscribe now to support the channel, and let us start with Frank's early days. Chapter 1. Broke at 40. The year was 1898. Frank Augustus Seiberling was 38 years old, unemployed, and desperate. His father had once been one of the most successful manufacturers in Ohio. John Seiberling had invented farm machinery that made him wealthy. The family lived well. Frank grew up expecting to inherit a thriving business. That expectation died in the financial panics of the 1890s. Banks collapsed. Businesses folded. The street railway company John Seiberling owned went bankrupt. The farm machinery company followed. By 1898, the family fortune was gone. Frank had a wife, Gertrude. They had 3 young children to feed. He had spent years working as secretary and treasurer in his father's company. Now that company no longer existed. He was trained for a job that had vanished. He needed to find something, anything. One day, Frank learned about an abandoned factory on the east side of Akron, a strawboard plant that had shut down. The building sat empty on 7 acres of land. The owners wanted $13,500 for the entire property. Frank did not have $13,000. He did not have $1,000. But he saw something in that empty building that others had missed. Akron already had rubber companies. The B.F. Goodrich Company had operated there since 1871. Skilled workers knew how to process rubber. They knew how to build products from it. A ready workforce existed, waiting for someone to hire them. Frank went to his brother-in-law, Lucius Miles. He asked for a loan. Miles agreed to lend him $3,500 for a down payment. It was an enormous risk for both men. With borrowed money in hand, Frank purchased the abandoned factory. He had a building. He had no equipment, no workers, no customers, and no products. He had only an idea. Frank decided to name his company after a man who had died penniless almost 40 years earlier. Charles Goodyear had discovered how to make rubber useful. He figured out that mixing rubber with sulfur under heat created a material that was strong, flexible, and durable. He called this process vulcanization. Goodyear spent his life trying to profit from his discovery. He never succeeded. He died in 1860, owing hundreds of thousands of dollars. The name Goodyear had become a symbol of brilliant invention and commercial failure. Frank Seiberling chose that name anyway. Perhaps he saw something of himself in Charles Goodyear. A man with a great idea and no money. A man the world had underestimated. On August 29, 1898, Frank and his brother Charles officially incorporated the Goodyear Tire and Rubber Company. Frank was not even the first president. That title went to David Hill, a business associate who had purchased $30,000 worth of stock. Frank served as secretary and general manager. The early products were humble: bicycle tires, rubber pads for horseshoes, tubes for carriage tires. The company employed a small crew in that converted strawboard factory. There was nothing to suggest that this struggling startup would become the largest tire manufacturer in the world. Frank was gambling everything on a simple belief. The automobile was coming. Most Americans in 1898 had never seen a car. Horses still pulled carriages through city streets. But Frank had read about the experiments happening in Detroit and elsewhere. Gasoline-powered vehicles would need tires. Lots of tires. The first years were difficult. Frank fought a legal battle with the Consolidated Tire Company over patent rights. His lawyers argued that Consolidated held an illegal monopoly on carriage tire manufacturing. The case dragged on for 2 years. Every dollar of profit from carriage tire sales sat in escrow until the courts decided. Frank won. The judge agreed that Consolidated had unfairly restricted competition. The money in escrow was released. The Goodyear company had survived its first major test. But survival was not enough. Frank wanted to dominate. He studied every aspect of tire manufacturing. He looked for weaknesses in existing products. Early automobile tires were terrible. They required specialized tools to mount on wheels. They went flat constantly. Drivers hated them. In 1901, Goodyear introduced a solution. The straight-side tire used an innovative braided wire bead that held the tire firmly to the rim. Drivers could remove it without fighting against the wheel. The ride was smoother. The tire lasted longer. Frank understood that a good product meant nothing without efficient production. In 1908, he worked with Chief Engineer William State to develop a machine that could build tires faster than any human hand. The Seiberling State tire building machine revolutionized the industry. Before this machine, workers assembled each tire by hand. The process was slow, inconsistent, and expensive. The new machine automated the critical steps. Production increased 12-fold. By 1913, more than half of all tires manufactured in America were built on Seiberling State machines. Frank became president of Goodyear in 1906. His small stature and relentless drive earned him a nickname among competitors. They called him the Little Napoleon. The name fit. Frank Seiberling had started with nothing but borrowed money and an empty factory. Now he was building an empire. Chapter 2. The Little Napoleon. Frank Seiberling was not a physically imposing man. His competitors towered over him in boardrooms. But by 1910, every rubber manufacturer in America knew his name. They called him the Little Napoleon, and most of them feared what he might do next. The Goodyear company had grown beyond anything Frank imagined when he signed the papers for that abandoned factory. The straight-side tire had proven wildly popular. The tire-building machine had slashed production costs. Now Frank wanted more. He wanted Goodyear tires on automobiles rolling off assembly lines in Detroit. In 1907, Goodyear opened a shop operation in Detroit specifically to serve the growing automobile industry. One customer would prove particularly important. Henry Ford was preparing to launch a car for ordinary Americans, not a luxury item for the wealthy, a practical machine that farmers and factory workers could afford. Ford needed tires, lots of them, cheap, reliable, and delivered on schedule. Goodyear became one of Ford's suppliers. The company provided tires for Model T automobiles starting in 1908. As Ford expanded production, Goodyear grew alongside. The automobile industry was creating demand for rubber that seemed almost limitless. By 1909, the company had expanded into aviation. The Wright brothers had proven that powered flight was possible. Now inventors across America were building flying machines. These aircraft needed lightweight tires for landing. They needed rubberized fabric for wings and fuselages. Goodyear provided both. The company began producing airplane tires and the specialized fabric that would soon cover military aircraft. Frank saw opportunity everywhere. If it required rubber, Goodyear would make it. He also understood the power of branding. Early in the company's history, Frank designed a symbol that would become one of the most recognized logos in the world. A winged foot, inspired by the Roman god Mercury, the messenger of the gods, the patron of commerce and travel. The Wingfoot trademark appeared on every Goodyear product. It suggested speed, reliability, and quality. Customers learned to look for that symbol. It meant they were buying the best. Frank treated his workers differently than most industrialists of his era. He believed that healthy, well-housed employees worked harder and stayed loyal. He also understood that labor disputes could cripple a manufacturing company. Strikes had damaged competitors. He intended to avoid that fate. In Akron, workers faced a housing shortage. The city had grown too fast. Thousands of laborers flooded in seeking jobs. Many found nowhere decent to live. Frank decided to build neighborhoods. Goodyear Heights would house factory workers. The company constructed homes that workers could purchase on reasonable terms. They became homeowners, not renters. They put down roots in Akron. For white-collar employees, Frank developed Fairlawn Heights, a neighborhood for managers and engineers. These workers would not leave for jobs in other cities. They had invested in Akron. The strategy appeared to work. Goodyear attracted skilled workers from across the rubber industry. They brought their families. The city expanded outward from the factory district. By 1910, Akron was becoming known as the rubber capital of the world. Goodyear was not the only company in town. Firestone operated nearby. So did smaller manufacturers, but Goodyear led them all. Frank kept pushing for innovation. In 1909, the company introduced the double diamond tire tread. The interlocking pattern provided better grip on wet and muddy roads. Automobiles of that era often struggled on unpaved surfaces. The new tread design gave drivers more confidence in difficult conditions. Engineers at Goodyear also developed pneumatic truck tires. Heavy commercial vehicles had always used solid rubber tires. These transmitted every bump and rut directly to the driver. Long hauls left men exhausted and vehicles damaged. The air-filled truck tire absorbed shocks. Trucks could travel faster with less wear on cargo and drivers. By 1918, Goodyear pneumatic tires were replacing solid rubber throughout the trucking industry. Frank accumulated patents. 19 separate inventions bear his name from his years at Goodyear. Improvements to tire rims, tread designs, manufacturing processes. He was not merely a businessman. He was an engineer who understood the products his company made. The numbers told the story of his success. In 1900, Goodyear employed a handful of workers in one converted factory. By 1910, thousands worked in expanded facilities. Revenue climbed year after year. Then came 1916. Goodyear officially became the largest tire manufacturer in the world. The company that Frank Seiberling had started with borrowed money now employed tens of thousands of workers. The little Napoleon had conquered the rubber industry. But Frank was not satisfied with commercial success. He wanted to leave a permanent mark on the world. He wanted something that would outlast quarterly earnings reports and production statistics. He wanted a home worthy of what he had accomplished, and he knew exactly who would help him create it. Chapter 3. The Singer from the White House. Gertrude Ferguson Penfield was not born into the rubber industry. She came from a different world entirely, a world of music, performance, and culture. She trained as a contralto singer. The contralto voice is the lowest female singing range. Deep, rich, and powerful. Gertrude developed her talent seriously. She was not merely a woman who enjoyed singing at parties. She was a trained musician. On October 12, 1887, she married Frank Seiberling. She was 21 years old, he was 28. The wedding took place in Lake, Ohio. The early years of their marriage coincided with Frank's professional struggles. When his father's businesses collapsed, Gertrude stood beside her husband. When he borrowed money to buy an abandoned factory, she supported the risk. By the time Goodyear began to succeed, the couple had been partners through difficult times. As Frank's business grew, Gertrude's reputation as a musician also expanded. At some point during the Taft administration, she was invited to perform at the White House. President William Howard Taft occupied the executive mansion from 1909 to 1913. Gertrude sang at a state dinner during his presidency. A contralto from Ohio, performing for the President of the United States. She became active in promoting music in Akron. The Tuesday Musical Association had been founded in 1887 by a group of women dedicated to musical education. Gertrude became one of its prominent supporters. The organization brought performers to Akron and offered concerts to the community. But Gertrude was not content to simply participate. She wanted to lead. From 1919 to 1921, she served as president of the National Federation of Music Clubs. This was not a local organization. It represented music clubs across the entire country. Gertrude had risen from performer to national cultural figure. In 1924, she founded the Akron Garden Club. Music was her first passion, but gardens would become her second. Both interests would shape the estate she and Frank were planning. The couple had 7 children together, 3 daughters and 4 boys. John Frederick came first, born in 1888. Irene followed in 1890. Willard Penfield arrived in 1892, James Penfield in 1898, Gertrude Virginia in 1899, Franklin Augustus Jr. in 1908. Their youngest daughter, Grace Winona, did not survive childhood. She died of bronchial pneumonia at only 18 months old. The loss marked the family. By 1910, the surviving children ranged from toddlers to young adults. The Seiberling home had become crowded. Frank's wealth had grown enormously, but the family still lived in a conventional house. It no longer matched their circumstances. Gertrude wanted something grander, not simply for display, but for purpose. She envisioned a home where music could flourish, a place with a room large enough for concerts, a space where she could host performers and artists. Frank had his own requirements. He needed space for business entertaining, room to host the executives and investors who visited Akron, a home that would impress. The children had wishes too. The boys wanted a swimming pool, not an outdoor pool that could only be used in summer, an indoor pool where they could swim year-round. Each family member contributed ideas about what their new home should contain, but it was Gertrude who would shape its character most profoundly. She would select the furnishings. She would work with the interior decorator. She would ensure that the house reflected not just wealth, but culture. Frank could build an industrial empire. Gertrude would build a home. Chapter 4. Across the Atlantic for Inspiration. By 1910, Frank Seiberling had the money to build almost anything, but he did not yet know what he wanted to build. He began purchasing land on the west side of Akron. Portage Township was farmland then. Rolling hills and fields, far from the smoke and noise of the factory district. Frank bought parcel after parcel until he controlled a vast stretch of countryside. The property had one distinctive feature: an abandoned stone quarry cut into the landscape. Previous owners had extracted rock from this site for years. Now it sat empty. A scar in the earth that most developers would have considered a problem. Frank saw something else. He saw possibility. American mansions of that era often imitated French chateaux or Italian palazzos. The Seiberlings wanted something different. They looked to England. In April of 1912, Frank and Gertrude prepared to travel to Great Britain with their eldest daughter, Irene, and their architect, Charles Schneider. They needed to see English manor houses firsthand. Photographs and drawings could not capture the feeling of these homes. They needed to walk through the rooms, to understand how centuries-old buildings could still feel welcoming. The trip almost began with tragedy. According to some accounts, the Seiberlings had booked passage on the Titanic for its scheduled return voyage from New York to Britain. The great ship sank on April 15, 1912, during its maiden voyage. There was no return trip. The Seiberlings traveled on a different vessel. They arrived in England and began their tour. Over the following weeks, they visited approximately 20 manor houses across the countryside. Each home offered lessons. Some were too formal, others too dark. A few felt more like museums than residences. 3 houses made the deepest impression. Compton Winyates in Warwickshire dated to the early 1500s. Built of rose-colored brick, it sprawled across its site without rigid symmetry. Wings and additions had grown over centuries. The result felt organic rather than planned. Ockwell's Manor in Berkshire was smaller but equally influential. Its timber framing and large windows demonstrated how medieval construction could create bright, open spaces. The Great Hall at Ockwell's showed how one room could serve as the heart of an entire household. Haddon Hall in Derbyshire may have been the most important of all. This medieval manor had been left largely unchanged for centuries. Its original features remained intact. Stone walls, wooden beams, gardens that flowed naturally from the architecture. The Seiberlings returned to Ohio with clear ideas. Their home would follow the English Tudor style, not a copy of any single building, an original design inspired by what they had seen. American materials and American craftsmanship serving an English vision. They also returned with a name. The abandoned quarry on their property had suggested it. In Old English, the words Stan Hywet meant stone quarry, or more literally, stone hewn. The name connected their new home to the land beneath it, to the rock that previous generations had cut from this hillside. Stan Hywet, pronounced Stan Hywet, a name that visitors would need to learn, a name that would not be forgotten once learned. Frank assembled a team to realize the vision. Charles Schneider would design the house. Warren Manning, a landscape architect from Boston, would shape the grounds. Hugo Huber, an interior decorator from New York, would furnish the rooms. Above the front door, they would carve a motto, Non Nobis Solum, Latin for not for us alone. The Seiberlings intended their home to serve more than their own family. It would welcome the community. It would host events and gatherings. Construction would begin in 1912. The Seiberlings had no idea it would take 3 years to complete. Chapter 5. 3,000 Blueprints. The scale of the project became clear when the architectural drawings arrived. 3,000 separate blueprints. 3,000 detailed plans showing every wall, every window, every beam. No detail was too small to document. Charles Schneider had designed a house unlike anything Akron had seen. The manor would stretch 300 feet in length. 4 floors, plus a basement that ran the entire distance. Over 64,000 square feet of living space. Groundbreaking took place in early 1912. The W.B. McAllister Company of Cleveland served as general contractor. They faced an immediate challenge. How do you deliver the enormous quantities of material needed for such a building to a remote hillside location? The solution was a railroad. Workers constructed a spur line directly onto the property. Train cars could now deliver stone, brick, lumber, and equipment straight to the construction site. The temporary tracks would disappear when the house was finished, but during construction, they were essential. The materials came from across the country and around the world. Red brick formed the exterior walls. Steel provided structural support. Sandstone and Vermont slate covered the roof. Copper flashing protected joints and edges. The interior required even more exotic materials, American oak for much of the woodwork, chestnut and black walnut for paneling in certain rooms. The Seiberlings also imported sandalwood, teak, and rosewood for special applications. The quarry on the property proved useful after all. Workers extracted stone from the site to produce sand and gravel for construction. Rock blasted from the basement excavation was repurposed to build garden walls along the property boundaries. The land itself contributed to its own transformation. Skilled craftsmen arrived from major cities. The Hayden Company of New York handled woodwork and paneling throughout the manor. Their craftsmen carved patterns into oak and walnut. Each room required different designs. The Hayden Company also created the plaster ceilings. They shared this work with the McNulty Brothers Company of Chicago. These ceilings featured elaborate decorative patterns in the Tudor style. Heineke and Bowen produced the leaded glass windows. Over 21,000 individual panes would eventually fill the manor's window frames. Samuel Yellen, one of the most respected ironworkers in America, created the decorative metalwork, door handles, hinges, light fixtures. Yellen was known for working in the tradition of medieval blacksmiths. For the tile work, the Seiberlings turned to Mary Chase Stratton of Pewabic Pottery in Michigan. The American Encaustic Tile Company of Zanesville, Ohio, provided additional tiles. Bathrooms and service areas throughout the manor featured their work. The project consumed 3 full years. Weather delayed outdoor work during Ohio winters. The complexity of the interior finishes extended timelines again and again. Frank Seiberling grew impatient. In May of 1915, he wrote to Schneider expressing frustration at the continued additional expenses. By October of 1915, Frank could wait no longer. He moved into the unfinished house himself to supervise the remaining work. Craftsmen were still installing fixtures, painters were still finishing walls. But Frank wanted to see his home completed. 2 months later, the family joined him. The Seiberlings spent their first Christmas at Stan Hywet in December of 1915. Some details remained unfinished, but the house was livable. After 3 years of construction, they were finally home. The total cost remains difficult to calculate precisely. Contemporary accounts suggest the manor house alone cost over $500,000. When landscaping, furnishings, and outbuildings are included, some estimates suggest the total exceeded $3 million. In an era when a typical American home cost around $3,200, Stan Hywet represented an almost unimaginable investment. And the Seiberlings would live there for the next 40 years. Chapter 6. Inside the Stone Quarry. 65 rooms. That was the final count when construction ended. 65 separate spaces spread across 4 floors and a basement. The numbers alone suggest the scale. 18 bedrooms, over 20 bathrooms, 23 fireplaces, 273 doors. But numbers cannot capture what it felt like to walk through Stan Hywet Hall. Visitors entered through the front door beneath the carved motto. They stepped into the great hall. This was the heart of the house, a massive room with a beamed ceiling overhead. Wood paneling covered the walls, tapestries hung between the windows, an enormous oriental rug spread across the floor. The great hall served as the central gathering space. All other rooms connected to it or radiated from it. To one side stood the music room. This was a 2-story space designed specifically for performances. An Aeolian organ filled one wall. A piano stood ready for concerts. The room could accommodate a substantial audience. The formal dining room could seat up to 40 guests at a single table. For large events, additional tables could be arranged. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling. The room connected to service areas where kitchen staff prepared meals. For smaller family meals, the breakfast room offered a more intimate setting. This space looked out over the gardens. The house included 5 guest bedrooms. Each had an adjoining full bathroom and walk-in closet. 8 additional bedrooms housed the live-in servants who kept the estate running. These staff quarters occupied a separate wing. The household required constant attention: cooking, cleaning, groundskeeping. A permanent staff lived on site to manage it all. Below the main floor, the basement held surprises. The most notable was the indoor swimming pool. Known as the plunge, it stretched across a large room. The pool was uniformly 8 feet deep throughout. A gymnasium occupied another section of the lower level. The family could exercise regardless of weather. Communication throughout this enormous house required technology. 37 telephones were installed across the estate, 26 of them within the manor house itself. The property connected to 4 separate phone lines, allowing multiple calls simultaneously. A communication hallway served as the central hub where staff could monitor and direct calls. Mother-of-pearl buttons appeared throughout the house. When pressed, they would summon servants to that location. The system allowed family members to request assistance without searching for staff. 12 chimneys rose from the roofline. They served the 23 fireplaces scattered throughout the building. In an Ohio winter, those fireplaces provided essential warmth. The house also had modern heating systems, but the fireplaces remained functional. A 4-story tower anchored one section of the manor. It provided views across the property and the surrounding countryside. 95% of the original furnishings remain in the house today. The Seiberling family kept almost everything: Persian rugs, Flemish tapestries, crystal chandeliers, Elizabethan beds, European paintings. When visitors tour Stan Hywet now, they see the rooms much as the Seiberlings arranged them. Chapter 7. The Gardens of Warren Manning. The house was only part of the vision. The land surrounding it mattered just as much. Warren Manning began shaping the grounds in 1911, before construction on the house had even started. He had worked with Frederick Law Olmsted, the designer of Central Park. Manning understood that the landscape and the architecture needed to work together. The grounds would not simply surround the building. They would extend from it. The original property was vast. Estimates vary, but the Seiberlings may have owned as much as 3,000 acres at the peak. Farmland, forest, and hills stretched in every direction from the manor house. The abandoned quarry presented both a challenge and an opportunity. Manning transformed it into a series of lagoons. 5 man-made ponds now filled what had been a scar in the earth. The Seiberlings used these lagoons for swimming and boating during summer months. Manning created what he called vistas, long sight lines that connected the house to the landscape beyond. He cleared specific trees and shaped specific plantings to frame views across the property. The birch tree allée was one of his signature features. A path lined with birch trees extended 500 feet from the house. At the far end stood a pair of tea houses overlooking one of the lagoons. Around the manor house, Manning designed a sequence of garden rooms. Each served a different purpose. The English garden became one of the most elaborate. A walled space filled with perennials and flowering plants. In 1929, the landscape architect Ellen Biddle Shipman redesigned this garden. Shipman was among the most prominent female practitioners in her field at that time. The Japanese garden occupied a former section of the quarry. Manning created the overall layout. T.R. Otsuka, a Japanese landscape artist from Chicago, built the garden in 1916. Additional gardens surrounded the manor. The West Terrace provided outdoor space adjacent to the house. The Great Garden served partly as a cutting garden, supplying fresh flowers for arrangements inside. Beyond the formal gardens, the grounds included recreational facilities. 2 tennis courts allowed for outdoor games. The Seiberlings built 1 court for family use and a second for the servants. A roque court provided space for that lawn game popular in the early 20th century. Horse trails wound through the wooded sections. A 4-hole golf course allowed practice without leaving home. Manning used primarily native plants in his designs. He grouped deciduous trees with smaller ornamental varieties. Swaths of perennials filled spaces between structured plantings. The property also included working agricultural land. Adjacent to the estate, the Seiberlings operated Portage Path Farm. Workers grew wheat and corn. They raised turkeys, chickens, ducks, and pheasants. A peach orchard produced fruit. Surplus milk went to the Akron Pure Milk Company. Over the following decades, portions of the original property were sold or donated. Today, Stan Hywet Hall and Gardens occupies approximately 70 acres. The gardens have been restored to Manning's original plans. Chapter 8. Fire over Atlantic City. In June of 1911, Frank Seiberling made an announcement. He would finance an attempt to cross the Atlantic Ocean by airship. The airplane was still a novelty in 1911. The Wright brothers had achieved powered flight only 8 years earlier, but some believed that lighter-than aircraft offered a better path to long-distance travel. Dirigibles could stay aloft for days. They could carry passengers and cargo across oceans. Melvin Vanneman would lead the expedition. Vanneman was an aviator and photographer who had already attempted one transatlantic crossing. In 1910, he had served as chief engineer on the Airship America, which failed to complete the journey. Now he wanted to try again. Seiberling agreed to fund the project. Goodyear would manufacture the gas bag for the new airship. The company had experience with rubberized fabrics. They could produce an envelope capable of holding the hydrogen needed for the flight. The airship was named Akron after Goodyear's hometown. It became the first airship that Goodyear ever built. The craft measured approximately 250 feet in length. Vanneman assembled a crew of 5 men. His brother Calvin Vanneman would join the flight. Fred Elmer, George Bortillion, and Walter Guest completed the team. After a series of test flights, Vanneman prepared for the Atlantic attempt. The departure point would be Atlantic City, New Jersey. The date was set for July 2nd, 1912. That morning, conditions appeared favorable. The airship lifted off shortly after 6 in the morning. Thousands of people had gathered along the boardwalk and beaches to watch. Estimates suggest as many as 20,000 spectators witnessed the departure. The Akron rose into the sky. It headed out over the water toward the open ocean. Minutes later, disaster struck. The airship was approximately 500 feet in the air when it exploded. Witnesses reported hearing loud sounds. The hydrogen ignited. The massive gas bag burst into flames. The burning gondola fell from the sky. Black smoke trailed behind it. The craft plunged into the shallow waters just offshore. All 5 crew members died. The spectators on the beach included the wives of Vanneman and his crew. They had come to see their husbands begin a historic journey. Rescue boats rushed to the crash site. The men had fallen from 500 feet. There were no survivors. An investigation followed. Experts examined the wreckage recovered from the water. The cause of the explosion remained uncertain. One theory suggested that internal pressure from overinflated hydrogen had ruptured the envelope. Another proposed that the suspension ropes connecting the gondola to the gas bag had failed. No definitive conclusion was reached. The tragedy came just 3 months after the Titanic had sunk. Both disasters involved ambitious transportation projects that ended in death. Goodyear would not launch another airship for more than a decade. The company eventually became known for its blimps. But that came much later. The lifeboat from the Akron was salvaged from the shallow coastal waters. It was shipped back to Goodyear, where it remained in storage for nearly a century. In 2010, Goodyear donated the lifeboat to the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum. Melvin Vanneman was 45 years old when he died. The New York Times called him a young man who could not be easily spared. Chapter 9. Life Behind the Stone Walls. Stan Hywet employed between 22 and 24 domestic servants during the years the Seiberling family lived there. Between 9 and 12 additional workers handled the grounds, gardens, and farm. The staff maintained a strict hierarchy. The housekeeper held the top position among female servants. The butler ranked just below. Each worker knew their place in the system. Female house staff occupied bedrooms on the 2nd floor of the manor. Male staff lived on the 3rd floor. The head gardener and his family lived in the gate lodge. The chauffeur and groom shared apartments above the carriage house. A poultry manager lived in a separate house near the chicken coops on Reynolds Avenue. The household operated on formal routines. Meals were served at set times. The cook prepared food in the basement kitchen. Staff moved through service corridors to avoid crossing family spaces. The Seiberlings entertained frequently. Notable visitors came to the estate over the years. Former President William Howard Taft stayed at Stan Hywet in November of 1920. He was traveling the country to promote the League of Nations and reportedly enjoyed breakfast with the family. Helen Keller visited the house accompanied by her companion Annie Sullivan. Will Rogers and Shirley Temple performed for the Seiberlings and their guests in the music room. The Von Trapp family singers also appeared at Stan Hywet. Christmas gatherings tested the capacity of even this enormous house. The formal dining room could seat 50. But that was not enough for the extended Seiberling family during the holidays. Adults and older children ate in the dining room. Younger children were seated in the breakfast room or north hallway. Frank Seiberling encouraged his adult children to remain at the house as long as they wished. Several did. The estate became home to multiple generations. Frank and Gertrude Seiberling celebrated 58 wedding anniversaries. They lived at Stan Hywet for 40 years. Gertrude died in 1946. Frank remained in the house until his own death in 1955. At Chapter 10. The Empire Crumbles. The First World War transformed Goodyear into a giant. The company manufactured Zeppelin fabrics, balloon materials, aircraft tires, and massive quantities of truck and passenger tires for the Allied effort. By the end of the war, Goodyear was producing nearly 4,000 tires per day. Annual revenues reached approximately $223 million by 1920. The company employed over 50,000 workers across its plants. Then the war ended. Government contracts disappeared. The economy slipped into recession. The downturn of 1920 and 1921 hit the rubber industry hard. Goodyear had expanded aggressively during the war years. Now the company found itself overextended with massive debts it could not pay. The numbers told the story. By 1921, sales had collapsed to $105 million. The company reported a loss of $5 million. The book value of Goodyear's common stock, which had stood at $75 million in early 1920, fell to zero. Preferred stock dropped on the market from $100 to $20 per share. Common stock plummeted from $132 to $5. Frank Seiberling had built one of the largest industrial enterprises in America. He controlled assets worth more than $100 million scattered around the world. But he could not collect enough cash to pay the company's immediate debts. Goodyear turned to bankers. In 1920, a syndicate headed by Goldman Sachs and Company of New York and A.G. Becker of Chicago provided temporary refinancing of $18 million. It was not enough. Bankruptcy loomed. In early 1921, a New York law firm connected Goodyear with Dillon Read and Company, an investment bank willing to manage a complete refinancing and reorganization of the company. The bankers would save Goodyear, but they demanded changes. The new owners asked Frank Seiberling to stay on as a manager. He declined. After 23 years, the founder walked away from the company he had built. His brother Charles also departed. Of the original leadership team, only Paul Litchfield and George Stadelman remained with the company. Edward Wilmer, a Milwaukee attorney and investment expert, became the new president. Years later, Frank Seiberling described that moment simply. "I was out in the streets without a dollar to my name," he recalled. "So I had to do something." He was 62 years old. Chapter 11. Starting over at 62. Frank Seiberling had a friend named Edgar B. Davis. Years earlier, during lean times, Seiberling had loaned Davis $57,000. Davis had gone to Texas, struck oil, and become wealthy. Now Seiberling needed help, and Davis remembered the loan. He gave the Seiberling brothers a $500,000 advance to start a new venture. Frank and Charles Seiberling purchased the Portage Rubber Company, a 10-year-old factory in Barberton, Ohio, just south of Akron. They reopened it as the Seiberling Rubber Company on November 21, 1921. The operation started small with approximately 200 employees. A laborer named George Green built the company's first tire. Frank Seiberling invited company officials to dinner at Stan Hywet and told his guests what he intended to accomplish. "Gentlemen," he said, "we are going to make the name Seiberling on rubber mean as much as the word sterling on silver." Most men in their 60s who had lost everything would have retired, but Seiberling started over. The results came quickly. The Seiberling Rubber Company manufactured tires for automobiles, trucks, buses, tractors, and earth-moving machines. The company developed innovations including the sawtooth tread pattern and heat vents designed to extend tire life. Within 6 years, Seiberling Rubber rose from 331st place in the tire industry to 7th. The company that began with 200 workers in an old factory had become one of the largest tire manufacturers in America. The advertising slogan captured the founder's reputation, a name you can trust in rubber. Frank Seiberling eventually stepped back from daily operations. His son, J. Penfield Seiberling, known as Shorty, became president while Frank moved to the position of chairman. Charles Seiberling, who had stood beside his brother through both companies, died in 1946 at age 85. Frank Seiberling retired as chairman in 1950 at the age of 90. He had spent more than 50 years in the rubber industry. "The strength of Seiberling Rubber Company has always been a joy and a source of pride to me," he said upon retiring. "I know that it will become stronger in the years to come." During the Second World War, Seiberling Rubber had supplied tires for heavy artillery pieces. After the war, the company continued to grow, but the tire industry was changing. Foreign competitors introduced radial tires, and the smaller American manufacturers struggled to keep pace. In 1965, the Firestone Tire and Rubber Company acquired Seiberling Rubber for $31.5 million. The Seiberling name eventually disappeared from American roads, but for more than 4 decades the company proved what its founder had promised. The name meant something. Chapter 12. The Meeting in the Gate Lodge. In May of 1935, a stockbroker from New York named Bill Wilson came to Akron for a proxy fight. He was trying to help take over control of the National Rubber Machinery Company. The deal fell apart and Wilson found himself stranded in Akron with $10 in his pocket. Wilson was an alcoholic. He had been sober for about 5 months, kept that way through his involvement with the Oxford Group. a Christian fellowship movement. Standing in the lobby of the Mayflower Hotel on Saturday, May 11th, he could hear the sounds of the bar nearby. He was tempted to drink, but realized he needed to talk to another alcoholic instead. Wilson started making telephone calls from the lobby. He called several clergymen listed in the hotel directory. Eventually, the calls led him to Henrietta Seiberling. Henrietta was the daughter-in-law of Frank Seiberling. She had married his eldest son, John Frederick, in 1917. By 1935, her marriage was troubled, and she was living with her children in the Gate Lodge on the Stan Hywet grounds. Henrietta had been trying for years to help a local surgeon named Robert Smith. Dr. Bob, as he became known, was a respected physician whose alcoholism had nearly destroyed his career. His wife Anne was a close friend of Henrietta through their shared Oxford group involvement. When Wilson called asking for another alcoholic to talk to, Henrietta thought she had found the answer she had been praying for. She invited both men to meet at the Gate Lodge on Sunday, May 12th. It was Mother's Day. The meeting was supposed to be brief, but the two men talked for hours. Wilson described his own drinking, the obsession and compulsion, and how he had found a way to stay sober. Dr. Bob listened. For the first time, he was hearing his own experience described by someone who truly understood. After that first meeting, Bill Wilson moved into the Smith home at 855 Ardmore Avenue in Akron. He stayed for about 3 months. The two men talked, read the Bible together, and attended Oxford group meetings. They worked on understanding what had helped them and how they might help others. On June 10, 1935, Dr. Bob had his last drink. That date is generally considered the founding of Alcoholics Anonymous. Later that month, the two men visited a patient at City Hospital named Bill Dotson, an attorney whose drinking had hospitalized him 8 times that year. Dotson became the third member of what would grow into a worldwide movement. By the end of 1935, there were 5 members in 2 small groups. The program they developed drew on Oxford group principles including self-examination, acknowledgement of character defects, making amends, and working with others. Wilson and Smith realized that helping other alcoholics was essential to maintaining their own sobriety. They could only keep what they had found by giving it away. The movement spread slowly at first. Meetings were held in homes. A book outlining the program, known simply as the Big Book, was published in 1939. The name Alcoholics Anonymous came from that book. Dr. Bob remained in Akron for the rest of his life. At St. Thomas Hospital, he helped establish the first hospital unit dedicated to treating alcoholism as a medical condition. He helped nearly 5,000 people achieve sobriety before his death from cancer on November 16, 1950. The Gate Lodge still stands on the grounds of Stan Hywet Hall. Every June, thousands of people travel to Akron for Founders Day, commemorating that first conversation between 2 alcoholics who discovered they could help each other stay sober. Chapter 13. Not for Us Alone. Frank Seiberling believed true prosperity was gained through the enlightenment and improvement of every citizen. He spent his fortune accordingly. When the rubber industry brought thousands of workers to Akron, housing became scarce. Seiberling purchased farmland near the Goodyear factory and developed Goodyear Heights, a neighborhood for his workers. He hired his landscape architect to design tree-lined streets and parks. When the board of directors refused to fund the project, Seiberling paid for it himself. He later developed Fair Lawn Heights for white-collar employees. Both neighborhoods still exist today. In 1914, Akron had only 1 hospital. Seiberling became a founding member of the People's Hospital, which opened in 1915. He served on its board of directors for over 2 decades. That hospital eventually became Cleveland Clinic Akron General. Seiberling helped establish the Akron Metropolitan Park District in 1921 and served on its Board of Park Commissioners from 1924 to 1935. Over 2 decades, he donated more than 500 acres of his estate to create Sand Run Metro Park. Additional land he once owned became the F.A. Seiberling Nature Realm, preserving green space for future generations. He supported educational institutions throughout his life, including his alma mater, Heidelberg College, the University of Akron, Lincoln Memorial University in Tennessee, and Western Reserve Academy. He served as president of the Akron Chamber of Commerce and founded the Fair Lawn Country Club. Gertrude Seiberling died in 1946. Frank remained at Stan Hywet, surrounded by the house they had built together and the gardens they had shaped. Frank Augustus Seiberling died on August 11, 1955, at the People's Hospital, the institution he had helped create. He was 95 years old. He was buried at Glendale Cemetery in Akron. The Akron Beacon-Journal wrote that he was a man of large gestures, lordly gambols, strong friendships, occasional humor, and invariable fighting courage. 2 years after his death, his 6 surviving children made a decision. None of them wanted to maintain the enormous estate. The costs were too great, but they remembered the words carved above the front door. Non nobis solum, not for us alone. In 1957, the Seiberling children donated Stan Hywet Hall and Gardens to a nonprofit foundation. The house that Frank and Gertrude had built for their family would now belong to the community. The estate opened as a museum. Visitors could walk through the same rooms where presidents and performers had been entertained. They could stroll the gardens that Warren Manning had designed. 95% of the original furnishings remained in place. In 1982, Stan Hywet was designated a National Historic Landmark, the first and largest in Akron. Today, it is the 6th largest historic home open to the public in the United States. Frank Seiberling started with nothing. At nearly 40 years old, he borrowed money from his brother-in-law to buy an abandoned factory. He built that factory into the largest tire company in the world. He lost it. He started over and built another. Along the way, he constructed a house that would outlast him, neighborhoods that would shelter generations, parks that would preserve the land he loved. The motto above the door proved true. What he built was never for himself alone. Chapter 14. The Grandson's Dream. On September 8, 1918, a baby boy was born in the Tower Infirmary of Stan Hywet Hall. John Frederick Seiberling, Jr. was the first grandchild born in the great house. His parents were Fred Seiberling and Henrietta Buckler, who had married in the music room 11 months earlier. For his first years, young John lived in the manor house with his grandparents. When he was 4 or 5, his family moved to the Gate Lodge on the estate grounds. He spent his childhood exploring the woods and fields surrounding Stan Hywet. The Cuyahoga Valley stretched beyond the property, a landscape of rolling hills and winding rivers. He later said these childhood wanderings gave him a dream of protecting the valley. John graduated from Harvard University in 1941. When America entered World War II, he joined the Army and was stationed in England. He received the Legion of Merit for his work helping to plan the D-Day invasion of Normandy. After the war, he earned his law degree from Columbia University in 1949. That same year, he married Elizabeth Baer, a Vassar graduate. They had 3 sons. John practiced law in New York before returning to Akron in 1954. He became an attorney for the Goodyear Tire and Rubber Company, the same company his grandfather had founded 56 years earlier. He worked there for 16 years. In 1970, at age 52, John decided to run for Congress. He was a Democrat in a Republican district, running against 10-term incumbent William H. Ayres. John campaigned against the Vietnam War. He won by 12 points in what newspapers called a major upset. Once in Congress, John set out to protect the Cuyahoga Valley as a national park. The National Park Service did not believe the valley deserved federal protection. But John worked across party lines with Republican Congressman Ralph Regula. By December 1974, a bill had passed both houses of Congress. President Gerald Ford was on a ski vacation in Colorado. Federal officials urged him to veto the bill because of the cost. John and his allies mobilized support. Ray Bliss, the former Republican national chairman from Akron, called the president directly. On December 27, 1974, President Ford signed the bill creating the Cuyahoga Valley National Recreation Area. John called it a Christmas gift for the people of Northeast Ohio. John then turned his attention to Alaska. As chairman of the House Subcommittee on Public Lands and National Parks, he spent years working on legislation to protect Alaskan wilderness. In 1980, with the election of Ronald Reagan approaching, John and his allies pushed for a final compromise. On December 2, 1980, President Jimmy Carter signed the Alaska National Interest Lands Conservation Act. The law protected more than 100 million acres of wilderness. It doubled the size of the entire national park system. It tripled the amount of federally designated wilderness in the United States. It remains the single largest expansion of protected lands in American history. Over his 16 years in Congress, John Seiberling helped preserve an estimated 129 million acres of wilderness across 27 states. That represents roughly 80% of all protected public wilderness in America. In 2001, President Bill Clinton presented John with the Presidential Citizens Medal. Clinton called him an environmental hero. John retired from Congress in 1987 and returned to Akron. He taught law at the University of Akron and enjoyed the Cuyahoga Valley he had fought to protect. His home sat at the edge of the park. He died on August 2, 2008, at age 89. The Akron Beacon-Journal called him one of America's great conservationists. In 2006, the federal building and courthouse in downtown Akron were renamed the John F. Seiberling Federal Building and United States Courthouse. John often credited his love of nature to his father, Fred, but he said the most influential person in his life was his mother, Henrietta. When speaking about historic preservation, John invoked his grandfather's motto. In 1977, he gave a speech to the Stan Hywet Guild titled Historic Preservation, Not for Us Alone. Frank Seiberling donated more than 500 acres of his estate to create public parks. His grandson protected more than 100 million acres of American wilderness. The family motto carved above the entrance to Stan Hywet guided them both, not for us alone,